Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 22 of the Future of Work show. I'm so proud to share that we've been doing these conversations around the future of work since June. Welcome to episode 22 of the Future of Work show. I'm so proud to share. Sorry, there's a little bit of conversations around the future of work since June. Sorry about that. That was just an artifact of the kind of windows I have open. So we've been doing these conversations since June, and we've invited some of the best academics and best practitioners to discuss so many ideas and practices connected with the future of work, many of which are going to impact all of our lives for the years to come. Over these 6 months, we've discussed topics as diverse as innovation, design thinking, entrepreneurship, robotic human interaction. What is it going to be like working with AI? Sometimes technology as our manager, in fact. What is it like to think about the future of marketing with artificial intelligence and analytics built in? But this month, the spotlight has been on the human resource function. And today's conversation is actually the fifth in this series. We started off with a conversation on exploring what the human resource function itself is going to look like over the next few years. And our first guest was Krish Shankar, who, as you might know, is the group HR head of Infosys. The second in this series was a conversation with Professor Anna Tavis of NYU on the performance management revolution. In case you haven't caught that conversation, do catch it. It was one of the most insightful conversations of this entire series because she spoke a lot about how the changes that we're seeing in performance management, in fact, have the potential to change the way organizations themselves are structured. Consequences far beyond perhaps many of us are even aware of. The third in this series was a conversation with Arif Aziz, who's the CHRO of Diageo India, on what the personalized employee experience is going to look like in the future. And earlier this week, I had a conversation with Manvi Baveja of Uber to explore what the gig economy is going to look like and what does it take to build engagement and culture with a large population of the organization being gig workers. Today's conversation is the next in the series, and we're going to look at a word that's been doing the rounds for the last several years, HR analytics and evidence-based HR. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, I am Shalini Lal, and I work at the intersection of people and organizations and the future of work, both as an educator and as an advisor. And that's the kind of work which Uncube does. So with that, let me bring on the guest for the day, Professor Jayanth Nrayanan of NUS. Hi, Jay.
Hi, Shalini. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad that you could join. Honestly, you know, the whole conversation around data analytics and particularly HR analytics has been so much at the forefront of all HR conferences for probably the last 5 or 6 years. And so much so that perhaps many of us have come to almost think of HR analytics as this magic wand that, you know, if you just sort of figured this piece out, you'd be able to, make far more insightful recommendations on several HR processes. In fact, let me share that as we're having this conversation, a colleague and I did a round of interviews with HR professionals over the last few weeks, asking them about what they thought about the future of HR. And the two key themes which came up time and again was the huge role of data, which almost everyone sees, and the huge role of technology. So those were the two key themes which came up. Right. Let me start by asking you what got you interested in analytics. For those of you who are joining us, let me share that Jay has a very wide variety of interests. He's a mindfulness practitioner. He talks about many of the softer sides of working, including what does it take to build a successful workforce which is remote. And at the same time, he looks at some of the far more left-brained conversations around analytics in HR. So what got you interested in this as a topic?
Thanks, Shalini. So this is almost like for me, it's my personal journey, right? Like all good Indian boys, I'm an engineer. And then I went into HR. So that although in the Indian context is not that much of an odd choice, because almost everyone just default lands in engineering somehow. And so for me, it takes me back to my days when I was training to get into this field, being an engineer. And thankfully in India, I think, like, there is an analytical component to almost any tertiary degree, right? Like, somehow, if you go into a business school, there is an analytical component to that, right? So the analytical side has always been something that has stuck with me, just because of the way I was trained. And the research enterprise has always been analytical, right? Like, so we've always been, even in HR, even in OB, which is my base discipline, we have always been heavily dependent on data for insights. And a lot of our PhD training also is very analytical. We are quite heavily trained in quantitative methodology, and we are all positivists for the most part. We all believe there is an ultimate truth, and numbers can lead you to that ultimate truth. So, even though we are studying things that are like poet-like, we are quite heavily quants, right? So in that sense, this move for me is not surprising. It's kind of, or rather, it's something that fits with who I am. But I think the whole reason why I think analytics has caught on in the HR circles, I see a couple of reasons for that. One is, I think we've also the other functions have been swept by the same sort of analytical revolution, and that's possibly due to the increase in computing powers that you see all around, and also the ability to kind of bring many pieces of data together into data lakes. So things that would happen isolated in organizations suddenly found themselves landing in one common container. And then you could start to see associations, and you could do that in supply chain, you could do that in finance, you could do that in the other disciplines. And to me, it was inevitable that HR would kind of come on to that sort of bandwagon somehow, because I think HR professionals have always kind of wanted a seat at the table, uh, and oftentimes when a CFO sits in a board meeting and says, "Here is my proposal. I need a capital expense, and here is how much money you're going to save. This is why you should do it." The decision maker, who's often the CEO, is likely to listen and say, "Here you go. You show me the money. Here is the money." Right? Whereas HR folks had to kind of skirt around these topics with kind of clever sounding words, and we had to there was also always a perception that we are a soft discipline, and that had its positives and negatives. So I think it was inevitable that the HR function would catch that language and that wave that's sweeping organizations. And I must say that HR is always in the academic HR circles. We've always used a lot of analytics. When we collect data from organizations and companies, when we publish our research papers, there's always been that analytical component. It just wasn't top of mind for industry, I think, up to a point. Although I must say, the arc of history, if you go back, I think 50s and 60s, actually, there was quite a heavy emphasis on using data in selection assessment post World War II, actually, in many parts of the world. So it's not as though HR psychometrics, for example, is a heavily quantitative discipline. So I think it also kind of, I think, caught on as a nice tagline, like it became very cutesy after Google published its findings and coined the term people analytics. And so you need these sexy kind of tags, and then it catches on. So I almost feel it's a bit of a old wine in a new bottle, almost, in some sense. But I'm happy to drink the wine in the new bottle, right? Like, it's it's great. I mean, it's great for people like me who can, yeah, why not? If you want to call it people analytics, I'll join you in the party, right? So, but I almost think that, which we will come to, I'm sure, later on in the conversation. I do think that it behooves us to remind HR professionals that this is not some sort of a panacea or a silver bullet that's going to solve all their problems. But we'll come to that part. But the arc of history is really, for me, HR kind of being swept over by the analytical revolution that's hitting almost all organizations and disciplines right now.
Jay, that makes sense because as you spoke about the field of psychometrics, the field of IO-psych was always very
Correct.
heavily, positivist and very, very number driven. And of
Exactly.
course, the whole field of OB and HR has always had this confluence of some aspects of which are far more soft, qualitative, coexisting with other aspects of the field which are very, very strongly data driven, as you spoke about.
Absolutely. And Shalini, I must admit for myself, right? Like I started off, for me, the journey has almost been the opposite of what is happening in the field. Like I was so heavily quantitatively driven, and I think as I come to my middle years, I'm also recognizing the richness of the qualitative data now, right? Like it's almost contrary to perhaps some of the forces out there, but I do think there is value in all sorts of data. It's just that as an engineer, for me, with this blinkers on, it's much easier to look at the world in a Cartesian 2 by 2 and then believe that you have insights. But often the world doesn't fit in neat 2 by 2s, and that's where as someone who's parent now and who's raising, you see the complexity of the world cannot be reduced to a few metrics. There is richness in the qualitative aspects of the data, and I'm actually learning how to do some qualitative research, and I'm amazed at how incredibly hard it is to do. So anyway,
Yes.
so today's conversation is about HR and analytics, so we'll stick to that, but I just want to kind of say that it's not a silver bullet, right? It's
No,
there is richness in it.
actually, Jay, I think it always helps to have both perspectives. And I'll say this because I was trained as a qualitative researcher. In my PhD, my entire methodology was qualitative, and I did my research methods courses in the anthropology department. So you can just
Wow,
about
kudos to you.
imagine.
You have to go native.
You have to go native, right? So it's all about, the participant observer and how do you create rich data sets and how do you read thick descriptions and make sense of them, etc., etc. And one of the big things that was spoken about in that part of the world is just about when was the last time that people truly changed their minds, or you made a genuine insight by data alone. It's the storytelling, which
Mm,
also has, by the way, just the way analytics has become, the word of the last 5, 6 years, so has storytelling.
storytelling.
So we are seeing
Yeah,
sort of a revival of, the quantitative aspect of it, along with people's longing and also recognition of the strength of the stories, which is very much part of the qualitative, research methodology. And I think that's helpful for even people, for HR leaders who are thinking about how to use analytics, just to keep in mind that it always, is always helpful to know when to use which, and, wherever it's
yeah,
possible to supplement the insights that you're generating through large data
yes.
with a much more empathetic and a more personal look at what's actually happening, and the two coming together to give insights which are sorry, this conversation went into another direction,
No,
but
no, no. I think this is spot on. Perhaps no, I mean, I love analytics. I like the whole, the engineering approach to solving HR issues, which is really what analytics is, right? Like you're able to generate very clear and crisp recommendations. But I think it's worth having this conversation because you want to provide a contrarian view so that you can get people sit up and think about these questions more deeper, because that's really what this is
yeah.
also behooving HR people to do, right? Like if HR folks as a function have not paid as much attention to the Cartesian world, then this is the time for them to wake up and say, hey, perhaps employees are leaving lots of data behind them, and we can use some of that data to generate insights. And then there is a kind of a virtuous cycle that builds. You start having the right conversations, making the right connections, so it's a virtuous cycle. It's not as though the data is telling you something and then it's time over, it's game over. It's really the feedback into, okay, now that the data is telling me this, the data is saying that hey, there is a certain intervention that's leading to greater engagement. Now can we have conversations around why that's happening? because often data gives you like a black box. It doesn't tell you what is going on. That's the nature of abductive reasoning, which is really you see patterns with no good explanations for why you see the pattern often. Now, if you are not epistemologically motivated to find why you're finding that pattern, you're going to leave very disenfranchised, because you don't know what the hell can you do? Because the one of the big
Jay, you've gone on mute for some reason. Yeah, your mic isn't connected. It's there. You're back.
Okay. So can you hear me okay? Without
Yeah.
my okay.
All good.
Something wrong with the with the mic.
Yeah.
So if you create that virtuous cycle where the data informs what sort of conversations you need to have, what sort of engagement you need to have, then you create a very positive self-reinforcing cycle. So I do think it's really like the yin and the yang of HR, right? Like you have the data and all of the analytical skills, but you don't lose out on those important roles that HR played, which is to have those conversations, have those connections, have those deeper engagement with the fraternity of professionals, right? Like, so that's, I think, key. And I'm in the process of designing an entire master's program, really, that kind of balances this out. It's not easy. It's a tough act because you can get deeply into the analytical, and that itself is a very, technical.
Universe.
Yeah, it's a universe, and if you get sucked into that universe and you lose the big picture, then you're really creating a bunch of nerds who are great for performing very foot soldier like functions, which is you give them a set of data, they'll tell you what the relationships are, but they don't quite know what those relationships mean, or where even or how the data is being collected, because data is really garbage in, garbage out, right? Like you put garbage in, you get garbage out. What insights you derive is truly dependent on the quality of the data that you collect in the first place. And if that data is not generated with sufficient understanding of the context in which people operate, then you're going to, so for example, you say, I'm going to measure employee engagement by how, by people's arrival times at work. Let's say I'm making something up. But if you live in a city like Bangalore and people don't arrive on time, I mean, and you're not having those richer conversations on why, you're maybe they're working already, even though they're not at work. Maybe people are using all kinds of compensatory mechanisms to actually keep themselves engaged at work, but you're not able to capture that. You're using a proxy. Then you don't see the richness of what that data is actually telling you. I'm just giving a very crude example. I don't think any organization does that, but I'm just kind of caricaturing it a little bit to give a sense of how we need to be mindful of some of those sorts of issues.
So, Jay, do you see, because like you said, I think there are two very big drivers for data analytics or HR analytics becoming a big thing, as part of also determining the way the HR function is going to operate in the future. One, of course, is the fact that there is data, there is data of a kind which was never available, earlier. And the second, that HR has often wanted to have data to support its recommendations. And I know that you spoke about it in the context of, comparing it with, say, a CFO's decision-making process, which always will have numbers. And many of the other functions also, have numbers when they come to the decision-making table. And HR has always sort of longed for that, I would say, having the right numbers which will influence other people whose primary decision making sort of filter has been numbers. So it's a very effective mechanism. So we are going to see HR analytics play a role in the way the HR function operates for many years to come. But do you think that there needs to be a more fundamental sort of almost education of all of us, HR leaders, non-data scientists, people who work with the data scientists who come in with the kind of analytical techniques on what it takes to ask the right questions. Because since you spoke about academia, asking the right question is the prized starting point, right? That do you know what is a useful question to ask, and then you start from there, which is quite different from the term itself, data driven decision making almost puts like the cart
Yeah,
before the horse. I'm wondering what you think about that.
absolutely right. So often I think methodological tools also prime us to ask a certain kind of question, right? So asking the right questions is important, but also to understand, I think for HR professionals to understand the power of these methodologies, what they can and cannot do, or what are simple, like when you basically what is AIML, all of that. The fundamentals of all of that is very simple, actually. It's really basically regressions. It's looking at, like, A/B testing, those sorts of ideas, like, what kind of learning models we can build. So the fundamentals of this discipline is not actually rocket science. There are many ways in which HR professionals can teach themselves some of these methodologies, and it's really like a good exercise, and also doing something different than what they're used to, right? Like, it's really breaking them out of some sort of a pattern in the way they think. So if they can be humble enough to kind of admit that this is something I need to learn, and I've seen senior executives come back to school and learn some of these techniques, and actually getting them. I had a colleague of mine who would get them to kind of hand code some of the data and compute some of the OLS regressions by hand, right? Like, even to do that by hand and see what's going on, to get you the real intuition of what these methodologies are. Now, you're doing that, let's be clear, not because you as a senior leader are ever going to do actually that, right? You're never going to do that by yourself. You're going to have an army of people, the data scientists, the number crunchers, who will do that for you. But having a methodological understanding intuitively makes you look at the world differently, because you start to ask a different sort of a question. You suddenly begin to realize, oh, I can actually, rather than say that, hey, we implement an intervention just because we think it's a good idea, we can actually put it to test. We can do some sort of A/B testing before we actually implement the intervention. So you start to realize that you can run small experiments. You don't have to do, like, big things straight away. You can do pilot projects, and you can be fast to fail, and you can bring all of that, some of the design thinking that you probably talked about in other episodes. So you can bring a lot of muscle, intellectual muscle, simply because you understand that methodology, right? So I think I would recommend, I think, HR people to actually do that. If many of them are already doing that, I know that they are. So that, but to keep an eye on why you're doing it. You're doing it to cultivate a certain mindset. And then you can go to the data scientists that you hire, who probably are agnostic to HR, at least initially, right? Like, you're not going to, there is no ready supply of people that understand HR problems and analytical methodology. That's actually what we're trying to create, hopefully in the future. But that's not an easy problem to crack. So you will often get people that will not have the HR domain knowledge, but they will be good foot soldiers for you, who can actually run some of the numbers. But you retain that intuition, that final ultimate, like, ability. So I like the word augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. It's really like the human and the agent together that solves the problems. And I think of the army of data scientists as a part of that ecosystem of agents that you need for you. Apart from the tools, those resources also inform you on how you can combine the insights by asking the right sort of questions. So like you said, it's not data driven HR. I would say it's like kind of data informed almost, and maybe, or like, HR informing the data informing. So it's kind of virtuous cycle that you need to build. It can't be like a linear process where there is a data lake and then suddenly you discover an insight that you had no clue about. Unlikely that that's going to happen if you continuously engage with your data.
No, that makes sense. And Jay, just to share to your question of where are you going to find people who bring both, back in the early 2000s, interestingly, uh, Google used to hire uh,
Yes.
from the doctoral programs actually of
Right.
HROB. They used to hire, their people analytics team. So it was really a power bunch. I'm sure that practice probably still exists, and Google has played, perhaps, I think, at least in the popular imagination, a very big role in popularizing the idea that if you're sophisticated with the use of data, you have powers which perhaps, by powers I mean the ability to come with insights that others don't. So
Absolutely.
that's the kind of muscle power it takes to, in one of the most sophisticated organizations as far as using data is concerned.
Yeah, and I mean, right now they're in the eye of the storm for other reasons. So no organization is infallible. And so yeah, so absolutely, Google pioneered that, and there are other examples of organizations that have used data well. But the key for me is to kind of emphasize this again, that it's not a silver bullet, right? Like, it's not going to be oh yeah, we've now kind of figured this out. This is the last frontier in solving human problems, because human beings are incredibly complex. And actually, the other thing that we haven't yet encountered is there is as we begin to utilize these technologies more and more in organizations, it's going to fundamentally change the nature of people itself. So a lot of data is actually past looking, and you are generating insights on the basis of the past. But the future may not look anything like the past, because now, for example, like we are in the midst of like some pretty heavy disruptions to the way human beings work with each other and engage with organizations. Now, if you had, like, let's say you had all kinds of employee engagement insights from the pre-pandemic era, and you say, oh yeah, we're going to, like, kind of, oh, in order to improve employee engagement, we're going to have like a nice cafeteria. I'm just making it up. But if people are not going into work and they're going to work remotely, then what? So how are you going to use past data to kind of project into future? So there is a discontinuity as well in the nature of work. That also makes it even more challenging to just rely on the analytics, because the analytics will not give you the complete picture. That's
Very
actually,
well said. Yeah,
yeah,
very well said. So, Jay, what I'm taking from the early part of all that you're saying is, one, uh, the recognition that the question is really important, and the question sort of comes first, and data informs decision making on that question. The other thing that you said that I think is really helpful is that whether or not people will be using data in their, as data scientists, a familiarity with the methodology will make them appreciate where it's going to be helpful and where it may not be helpful.
exactly.
Um, the third thing which you spoke about was your own appreciation of, while so analytics gives you insights of a certain kind, but to go deeper into these insights and really understand what's happening at the level of the person, uh, you know, I guess in organizations you won't really call it qualitative research, but just having conversations or observing what people are doing, as say the design thinking folks would say, observation, conversation, empathy, etc. So it's sort of a combination of both that will lead to actually some of the best kind of decision making.
Yeah.
Is that a good summary of what you've
Yeah,
said? Is that,
absolutely. And I want to share a little story that I heard recently. It's an interesting example, without going into too much details of this, right? It's not in the context of HR, but it's quite informative, given that you also have this anthropological bent of mind. I recently met an interesting anthropologist by training, who has his name is Stephen Lansing. He's here at INSEAD as a research fellow, and he studied the Balinese water terraces for many decades. And one of the interesting insights they've had. So the Balinese have used the moon and the moon cycle to actually determine how they manage their water table, right? Like, without going into much detail on how they do it, but essentially, if you look at it, why should the moon have anything to do with water table? Let's, like, kind of use data, and let's use let's use our latest understanding of water and how water flows and implement a different intervention. That's what the agencies, water agencies, tried to do in Bali. But essentially, that actually killed the crop in Bali. So if you go back, the traditions that were there over thousands of years, that the Balinese indigenous people had recognized this connection to the moon, it turns out had a scientific basis. So simply because something doesn't have data, but it's a time-tested practice in your organization, doesn't mean that it's not scientific. It's just that the science behind it may be tacit as of now. So if you throw all of that out and say, I'm just going to implement what Google has done and improve employee engagement with giving more people voice in the organization, but you're a terribly hierarchical company where anybody who raises their voice is going to be immediately killed, you're not going to get any engagement. In fact, you're going to get a flight response, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just because something doesn't have data yet, it doesn't mean it needs to be thrown out. It means that it has stood the test of time. You don't quite know why. So to engage with it deeply, like an anthropologist would do, well, I'm not saying data is unimportant, but to also recognize that the interface of evidence as well as something that has stood the test of time with traditions and ethos that your organization stands for, that becomes very vital and critical. And this is somewhat ironical to bring up in a discussion on data analytics and HR, but I'm really singing this song because most forum people will be card carrying members of analytics without really paying attention to the richness of human existence, which often is not purely Cartesian. There is depth to that. There is tremendous complexity to that, and we can't reduce it to just two numbers on a dashboard.
Very well said. It's almost like really recognizing that, data itself comes in many different forms besides the numbers.
Exactly.
I'm going to take some questions and comments here.
Sure.
Hi, Colonel Navinder. Thank you. Thank you, Rohit. Thanks for joining us. Jason says, AI has truly revolutionized all segments. I think business intelligence is very important when it comes to get efficient outputs. No, absolutely. I think you're right, Jason. Vinati says, context, behavior, incentives shift, as a process of change. Jason says, qualitative approach in storytelling, I think, can be a people-oriented methodology, and HR leaders can relate to it, solving genuine problems. Absolutely, Jason. I think one of the things Jay is saying is that despite the fact that he's so strongly rooted in, the analytics world and is in fact creating a whole master's program around the use of analytics, when the two come together, you truly have a much more, maybe a more complex and a much more deep understanding of what's really going on. Papia, hi, thanks for joining. One of the challenges is to bring in all the data available in one place. Talent data does not speak with engagement data, learning data, or demographic. The quality of data giving like 360 view of employees is also missing. I think that's a great point, Jay. What is your thought around, if HR were to use data in a more traditional sense in particular, what kinds of systems would be helpful to allow, insights from data of all kinds to come together?
So that's a great question. And I think this is something that we're going to kind of spend a fair amount of time in the master's trying to educate, because what the masters is trying to build is junior professionals getting into the HR industry. So oftentimes we can't quite solve problems of today if we don't think ahead into the future. So these data lakes that the questioner is asking, you need to think ahead and say, any people related data can come into one data lake. So you don't quite know what the insights you're going to generate in the future are. But if you have a way to kind of bring that together, and with good data engineering, you can actually do that. And you may be surprised what is actually people. All data is people data, because people are the organization. So as long as your people data is actually talking to the entire data lake that exists in the organization, you may be able to generate insights and find relationships that often you did not think right now was even there, because this is the nature of abductive reasoning. So the whole idea of abductive reasoning is you don't quite know why the patterns emerge. When you don't quite know why the patterns emerge, you don't quite know where to look for patterns in the first place. So you're kind of really saying, this is really the complexity of the data matrices out there. I'm going to go and, like, wear my detective lens, and you don't have to do that. The computer program will do that. You go and look for patterns in the data. So now the best thing for you to do is have as large a data set as possible, have as many things go into that data lake as possible, have those data lakes talking to each other, so that in the future you can find things that you don't even know what you're going to be looking for in the future. So that, I think, is a very important question. And often you can't have a separate people data lake and assume that it's not going to talk to the rest of the organization. I think they need to be integrated with some key fields that will tie one data set to another. So and also the other complexity of the data is also relationship data, because when you have people as the node in your data set, that's one level of complexity. But if you have relationship as the unit of analysis, you have a lot more possible combinations
Yeah.
and combinations. So you want to capture some of that element as well. Like, so some of that is being done with looking at email data, looking at, like, kind of contact data. So who contacts whom, how often people contact each other, how often, location data. I mean, this brings us to privacy issues as well, like in terms of where are people congregating, how are people moving in the organization, what sort of movement patterns lead to engagement of teams. When people are remote, what sort of time stamps exist on some of the emails people have exchanged, and do they actually lead to engagement? These are open-ended questions which you don't know anything about now. But if you assume that, oh, email traffic data is not people data, it's something else, you're going to miss that key piece of insight. So to find a way for different data sources to overlay on each other in some meaningful manner, which I think is data engineering problem. So it's a data engineering, it's people-centered data engineering, right? Like you're thinking about it even as you design your data lakes at the organizational level.
Interesting, Jay. So are you saying that even things like social network analysis are going to become part of this?
It's already, Shalini. There's lots of research now looking at movement data, networks data. In fact, network data is the next big thing, right? Like, I mean, social network analysis has been around for a long time.
20 years. Yeah.
Sociology. So it is now, I think there are like I've heard of a couple of startups that's looking at generating insights through email exchange patterns in organizations, not really looking into the text of the email, because that leads to sort of privacy concerns. But actually, that's only a matter of consent, and we'll come to the privacy, which is a big piece. But you can look at those patterns and see engagement. You can look at how emails are exchanged. There is actually a nice HPR piece that Noshir Contractor wrote a couple of years ago that looks at the whole relationship as the unit of analysis rather than the person as the unit of analysis in any of your people analytics functions.
Very interesting. So data engineering is the field which will sort of have to design the architecture for how these different elements of data connect with each other, to look at potential future questions which we are not at this point aware of. And I like that. For me, it's a bit of a revelation that organizations are already using social network analysis overlaid with the people analytics. I know Microsoft does that.
I mean, they already have all kinds of capabilities. And this was like, in about 10 years ago in the Teams literature, there was this whole like buzz around this on this thing called social badges, right? Like you could give people a little transponder, people would wear that, and then you would track people, and then looking at how they moved and how they met with each other.
Like a Black Mirror episode or something like that. Right?
Yeah, the people keep often referring to that. I haven't seen that show, but very much. But you have that. It's the phone. You already have that now. Your social badge is your phone. So if you give permissions to apps like you do mindlessly, how many of you read like all the user agreements. You just say yes, your phone's tracking you all the time. So using some of that data, location badges data, you can generate a lot of insights. And I'm pretty sure there are organizations, there are startups that are trying to do that, and I'm sure there are large organizations that are attempting to do that as well. It's not my area of research, but I do know that it's possible.
But then, Jay, let's take a question we would otherwise come to maybe a little bit later. Just the whole conversation around ethics and privacy of data. Um, I had Professor Amit Joshi on some weeks
Yeah,
ago,
yeah,
and one of the things he said, which I'd love to hear what you think about, is just the fact that um, the legal field around ethics is, lagging far behind where actual practices. And so I'm going to tie that with the fact that a lot of these forward-looking articles, the big ones like Cognizant's 21 Jobs of the Future, NHRD also created, what will CHR of 2030, look like, and many others, have spoken about the importance of, ethics. So having people who, just have that responsibility of
yeah.
people ethics, data ethics, etc. What are
Yeah.
your views on these roles, and what will it take to have a good person in these roles?
Great question, Shalini. I'm going to give like a slightly, maybe a different response to what Amit or anybody else would have said, maybe, but I don't know, maybe not. So I actually think that you need more governance and legislation around these than merely sensitizing corporate professionals and executives to these sorts of issues. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. You should very much do that. Sensitize people to ethics around data, ethics around data usage, data collection, consent, many of those issues. We can go into that. It's, I'm sure there's like a whole podcast to be done just about that. And that's all well and fine. You can kind of do that. But what we do know about organizations is that for whatever it is worth, organizations do have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And there is a certain, I'm not saying organizations don't care about ethics. Of course they do. But it's often in the rear view. It's often like, it's not what's in front of them. It's often what they see behind them. So I do think that you need legislation and more policy interventions on what organizations can and cannot do. That's what's going to move the needle in terms of practice. So, for example, I think there's one piece of legislation. I know very little about this, but I know it exists for sure. I don't know the nuances of it. The UK, I think, came up with a legislation that in order for us to improve the gender wage gap, organizations of a certain size have to disclose the average pay of men versus women at every level in the organization. Now they introduced that, and just by mere introducing this as a legislation, it has started to reduce the gender wage gap, because now you're in the public domain with your name sticking to a piece of statistic. So that you need those sorts of legislations, best practices that are either adopted because there is a legal compliance issue, or there is some sort of institutional pressure that, like, a bunch of, like a NASCOM in India, for example, says, if you're a NASCOM member, you have to have these data governance. I don't know, maybe they already exist. I'm just kind of saying that. So I think you need some norms and regulations that comes into organizations from the outside, simply because these are too complicated for an individual or an organization to navigate. And just by the nature of people's lives and jobs, there's enough on their plate, enough for them to be worried and concerned about, that in the hubris of actually doing good, people may actually do inadvertent harm. I mean, if what happened at Google, we don't know what's happened with this recent episode. I don't want to comment on something that I know less about, but it seems like, even in an organization like that, where there's so much voice and people, if there was real censorship, then just tells you that nobody is infallible. And I think it's only human for us to focus on our key goals that lies in front of us. So the ethical goal, the moral imperative, is not going to be top of mind, in my view. Even I'm not a cynic at all by any means. I think people are capable of self-governance, but somewhere, I have learned over the years that you need legislation, you need governance from the outside.
I can understand what you're saying. So you're saying that yes, legislation is probably
Hmm?
lagging behind where technology and data actually is, and therefore there needs to be a conversation around this at a much higher, outside organizations, either industry bodies or other national level organizations, or maybe in global organizations, on what the ethics of people data are. But at the same time, do you also see that for organizations to be able to follow whatever guidelines come out from these recommendations and their own individual organizational guidelines, do you see the need for um, be it a chief ethics officer, be it a people ethics officer, or roles which look at data and ethics within organizations? Do you see that as
I almost don't think I almost don't want it to be a separate role, actually, because then it becomes a political battle between the person playing that role versus someone playing another role. I think this needs to be embedded into every function. Like, I think the marketing function, the finance function, all of them actually have to have the core of ethics, actually, that should be there in all functions, rather than it being, because when you create a role, it generally becomes that role then trying to find legitimacy, and trying to find resources to get compliance from the others. I mean, you can do that as well, maybe as an additional step, but I don't know whether that's going to solve the problem per se. Maybe that role can exist in the if you want to give that role some teeth, you need some legislation that this chief ethics officer can actually rely on as their source of power, right? If they have to simply use persuasion and influence and just pure political skills to get their agenda moving forward in organizations, they're going to be far behind. But because they're not going to be top priority unless there is unless you're a pharmaceutical company and there is like a clear ethical damage that your bottom line can suffer. Often this can become the kind of we also make ethical decisions kind of thing, right? So I'm not a cynic by any standards. I think organizations, for the most part, have good intentions. They want to do good. Most organizations want to do good in the world. No organization has a mission statement say we want to harm the planet, right? Like, even organizations that are kind of mining the hell out of the world, they also have intentions, right? They're doing the right thing. So I don't think that there are evil people. It's just that you need some sort of collective will that nation states and world bodies impose, because organizations are not, they're not the most important stakeholder of society, right? Society is large. So we need to inform as a collective species. We have to say what can organizations do, what can they not do. We need to impose that will on them. And I think the kind of conversation we are having around social media now, for example, and how they are able to a small number of companies are able to create disproportionate impact on our existence as a species through how elections are run, how truth is no longer one truth now. It's so that kind of power is what organizations have. So we can't just let this in the hands of executive.
I get what you're saying. I get the fact that I think the questions are too big for one company to even be able to address on their own. And the fact that if you have people in whatever chief ethics officer or whatever roles which are ethics oriented, they won't necessarily have enough influence in the organization unless there is outside legislation. Like, for instance, if you're working in one of the financial institutions, your people who look after regulatory affairs, obviously are very important, because your existence depends on your ability to work within those lines. So definitely I see the importance of that. I do though feel that probably from the internal organization, just to make it a reality, you will need people who will be able to sort of give guidance on the day-to-day decisions of, you can do this, you can't do this, even understanding what the legislation, what does the line mean, and where it's a gray zone, what do you do with that? Or so you'll need people who can sort of
Interpret that. No, absolutely, you're right. That's true. That is absolutely true. You're right, and we are only beginning to scratch the surface here,
yeah
Shah. I think the next big frontier is going to be genetic data, right? So,
yeah
and of course, there are already all sorts of regulatory mechanisms in place when it comes to the use of genetic data in the medical and pharmaceutical domain. Really, like we talk of personality, we talk of so many other means to measure individual differences, but there is a whole bunch of information that you can get out of just genetic information, and there are already existing regulatory mechanisms in place. For example, I think there are, like you cannot use any kind of genetic data as an organization in the US for hiring or for firing or any of that purposes. There are those, and there is that, there is almost like when you cross the biological barrier, you no longer feel there is any ethical. Of course, I shouldn't share my genetic data. That seems to be the obvious choice. But what if you could actually find genetic footprints in employee data, for example? Let's say, like, I have a sample of people whose genetic information I have. I know their some sort of work patterns. I've done some of this work. I mean, not exactly this, but I can easily see how I can impute someone's genetic information from really the signatures they leave behind in terms of their digital footprints. What if I then use that as a proxy for something else? I'm not collecting genetic information.
yeah
Using digital footprint data as an indicator of something much deeper.
yeah yeah
Then what do you do? Can you actually create some sort of legal boundaries so that you can't cross some lines? I'm not an expert on this. I know that there are huge landmines waiting to explode as we go into
I
this
think
domain,
so too.
and
Jay,
we are beginning to scratch the surface.
Can you give like a couple of examples, maybe from the organizations you work with or even research, one or two questions which maybe if you're an HR leader, you should absolutely look at, having a good data architecture for being able to answer. So, what would be the kinds of really good questions where
Yeah.
data would be very
Yes,
helpful?
I think the obvious ones are that things that organizations care a lot about, the one on performance, and performance is and engagement, employee engagement. And here again, the trend now, I think I've seen this in a couple of startups, is not to look at engagement as something static, something more continuous, because people's levels of engagement ebb and flow, and there is information in the ebb and flow rather than in that one static engagement survey that you do at the end of the year. So there are a number of good pulse methods that are available now. Data on, hiring and selection is another big domain. It's always been data driven, but there again there are, like, some cautions to use, right? Like, so it's not one of those blind. Let's just look at a number and look at whether to hire a person or not. You need to have multi-pronged approach to hiring and selection. With hiring and selection, I have a caution because I've done some work on this one. So you can get a really good accuracy if you use good analytical methods to get your hiring and selection process right. Okay, you can do that very well as long as you have good quality data, you have good quality criterion. You can actually nail it down, right? Like, really nail it down. But the problem is, will people perceive this to be a fair process? And my research shows that actually you may have the perfect bias-free method, but to a pool of applicants, your method can still appear to be unfair. because somewhere they do not have agency to actually impact the method. They're submitting a resume, they may be submitting some sort of video testimonial of who they are, and it goes through a black box, and then they're told whether they are shortlisted or not, or selected or not. That can seem very objective and bias free, but it is not for people in people's mind, because everyone thinks they're somewhat unique, and they think that if I could sit in front of a human being and share their point of view, even though they know that this human being may have bias, people are okay to live with that sort of agency. When you're talking to a non-human agent, you feel a sense of lack of agency. So that seems to create perception of unfair. At least that's what my research shows. So this could be a time problem. Maybe it'll go away. Maybe as people start using these, methodologies, that will go away. But the caution I have here is the typical HR functions like hiring, selection, performance management, employee engagement. These are very traditional HR roles. You might think there are like ready-made quick fix HR analytical solutions to some of these problems, but the devil is really in the detail. When you go into this, when you start implementing it in your context, you may have some unforeseen externalities that you did not foresee when you actually started an implementation process. So I caution, not to buy off the shelf things and, oh, this worked in organization A, so it's going to work for me too. To really think about your organization. I'm not saying every organization is special. I mean, there are commonalities, but to say what might be the customization that's needed for your context, how might this work, not work, what may be some unforeseen consequences, and how will you manage those exceptions? If there is an error, a type 1 or a type 2 error, what kind of error can you live with? What kind of error can you not live with? What are the reputational fallouts of making one of those two errors? So you want to kind of think about all of these questions before you buy off the shelf solutions from very enthusiastic startups that are creating wonderful solutions, but you really need to kind of think about them more carefully.
Thanks, Jay. I also realize we're coming to the end of our time. So I'm going to ask you one last question. If you were to give advice to an existing HR leader or an aspiring HR leader for how could they begin to prepare themselves and educate themselves for being a good, judicious, wise user of data, what would your recommendations be?
Yeah, so I think, I'm going to say, I recommend a book from 1950s. There is a wonderful book from a clinician, and I can send it to you, and you can probably put it in the show notes, which talks about how a simple statistical model often is enough to solve a lot of organizational issues. So really to go back to basics of what is regression, what can it do, what it cannot do, what is an actuarial prediction, what is a clinical prediction, simple concepts like that. What does it take? Even understanding something as simple as the central limit theorem, the importance of a certain number of data points before you infer any kind of causality. Those are simple, basic 101 statistical insights. To really kind of go back to that and to really kind of marinate in that before going into anything fancier, right? And then I think I would recommend, with all these wonderful online sources, I think to really get the 101 of what is AI, what is machine learning, what can it do, what can it cannot do, to really understand that at an intuitive level, and to not worry about being, the emperor's new clothes. Like, not to, if you don't understand something, and if you're a senior leader, that's totally fine. I mean, it has to be at a level that you have to understand, because these are basic insights. And that shouldn't take much of your time, to be honest. And hopefully we will create some of that content actually going forward as well. And from the program that I am designing, I'm hoping to create some of those content as well as I go along. So stay tuned, watch out. We might have some of those content coming out as well. But yeah, to really not be afraid of asking the dumb questions, to not be afraid, and to go back to 101 stats really is what you need. That equips you with what I was saying earlier on, the methodological mindset, and then you can begin to start asking the harder and the deeper questions out of your data science.
Thanks. I think that's really helpful, Jay. So what you're saying is that there is an educational component to it, and that educational component means at least reacquainting oneself sometimes, or maybe for the very first time, with some of the most, say 101 concepts within data, stats, AI, ML, so that you have at least a foundation on which you will then develop your intuition of what this methodology will be helpful for or not. And then second, to use this intuition you develop to think about, okay, so what are the questions where this will be really helpful? And that's, I assume, where your ability to play the role of an evidence-based HR professional comes into play, because you understand what are the right questions to ask, and you understand what are good ways to look at data sets to help answer some of those questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Jay. This was so wonderful. I realized we're absolutely on the hour. And honestly, we could just go on. And I wasn't necessarily sure that on this topic we would have so much to talk about, but I really do believe we've barely scratched the surface on this.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about, and hopefully we keep engaging. And I'm happy to be a part of conversations with you, Shalini. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. So I hope you really enjoyed that conversation. As I said, we've been having a series on what HR is going to look like for the future. Uncube is also developing a program for future HR leaders to look at the major shifts in mindset, concepts, ideas that are going to really shape the HR function of the future. So keep a lookout for that. And I will, of course, introduce that sometime early next year. With that, we come to an end of our show today. If you liked the conversation, feel free to share it on your wall. All earlier recordings of our conversations, right from the start, the 20-ish episodes and now soon 22 episodes, will be available on the Uncube website. They're also absolutely available free of cost for anyone who wants to use them for any kind of educational purpose. So if you're an educational institute and you want to have access to those conversations to share with your students, do reach out to us. We really want to, spread the ideas, spread the knowledge, and spread the conversations. With that, thank you very much, and do join us next time. Bye. Have a great rest of the day.